MIDI devices in Cubase allow us to control patch changes and allow for powerful editing functions. Before we get into the powerful editing possibilities, let's look at patch changes. We're going to talk about how to set up and install MIDI devices, how to select patches, and how to create MIDI devices from scratch. Go to the Devices menu and select MIDI Device Manager. On the left is a list of currently installed MIDI devices. Right now, nothing is set up, so you won't see anything yet. We can install devices here, remove them, and export and import setups, so we can save them for later or use them in other projects. Once a device is selected, you can open it by clicking here. Now let's install a MIDI device. Click the Install Device button. If your device isn't listed here, you can define a new device at the top. If you have a GM or XG compatible device, you can select either of these. I happen to have an older Yamaha SY77 synth here, so let's select it and press OK. Now we need to select the output we have our MIDI device hooked up to. If you don't see any outputs listed here, make sure you enable them in the device setup or watch level 1 of this video series on how to make MIDI ports visible. Setting the output makes things easier and automatic later on. After you select the output, make sure your device is selected on the left and press the Open Device button. Then select Patch Banks here. This is a list of all of the sound patches in your MIDI device. In my case, the patches from the SY77. The SY77 has 3 modes for selecting sounds: voices, multis, and voices in multis mode. Other devices could have names like patches, performance, voices, drums, and so on. Now select Bank Assignment here. You can determine whether Cubase will pick voices, multis, and voices and multis when you pick your MIDI device on a MIDI track's output. Generally, you'll want to use multis and voice, as this is the most common way of sequencing with this MIDI device. Close the MIDI Device Manager. Back on the project page, create a MIDI track and select the MIDI device you just created as the output. Select the MIDI channel you want to use and then click on the program selector. Now you can see all of the programs that are on your device and you can select them. You can use Filter to search for program names. Sometimes the program names aren't correct because you changed them or because you performed a software update on your device which has changed some of the programs around. Let's go back to the MIDI Device Manager and open the device. Go to Patch Banks and turn on Enable Edit. Let's change the name for some of the programs. I'll just place the number 1 at the end of each of them to make it easier to spot the changes. Turn off Enable Edit. When we go back to the MIDI track, we can see the changes we've made. Now let's make a new MIDI device from scratch. This is useful if the device we own isn't in the list of devices that Cubase has. Select Install Device again, but this time choose Define New. For the Channels section, think about your MIDI device. If you consider every MIDI channel equal and the same, then pick all of the channels you want to use from the Identical Channels list. What I mean is that if your MIDI device sees all the patches or programs as equal, like on the Access Virus synths for example, then select Identical. If your MIDI device, for example, sees channel 10 as exclusive for drums, or you want to stick to that standard, then choose 10 for individual channels. Something else to consider is if you are creating device panels like we'll explain in the next video, and you want the panel accessible to all MIDI channels, you should select Identical. You can set the type of MIDI messages the channel will support. You may want to play it safe and click on all of these options. Or you may know that you never use modulation or sustain, so why not turn it off? Next is preset type. Preset references contain the patch name and the corresponding MIDI message, typically program change and bank select. Snapshots contain a patch name, but in addition, complete parameter settings. Make sure you read about snapshots in the MIDI devices manual. If this option is checked, you can take a snapshot of every single channel. Activate sysx parameters if you wish to use sysx information with your device. You might want to dump information back and forth to your device like a MIDI bulk dump. Or you may be an experienced MIDI programmer and use the sysx commands to control your device. It's good to activate snapshots if your device supports this. It memorizes all of the parameters in a device. I know all of this can seem very overwhelming. If you want to get started quickly, then select all the channels here, select Preset References, and type in a name. Then hit OK. Select Patch Banks and activate Enable Edit. From the Commands menu, choose Create Bank. Let's rename it Programs. Banks are the highest level in this list. Now we can create folders in the Programs list by selecting New Folders here. Organize your patches in the same way as they are on your synth, or in a way that makes sense to you. In the case of, let's say, a Korg Trinity, there were 8 folders with 32 programs in each folder. Folders make things easier to use, saving you from having to look through a large list of patches. I'm going to make 2 folders, Bank A and Bank B. Generally, you'll want to add multiple presets at a time, since most devices have about 100 or more programs in each. Choose a folder and select Add Multiple Presets here. I'm going to have 128 presets in Bank A and 128 in Bank B. With patch changes, you need 2 things: the program change number and the bank change number, which is the control change number. This is used for going between different banks like Bank A and Bank B and so on. 0 to 127 means you'll have 128 presets, so just leave this. Now this is the hard part. You'll have to do a little bit of work here. Consult the user manual for your MIDI device and find out what control changes used to select between the different sound banks. If you have expansion cards, find out what the control changes are for them too. It's a good idea to write them down so you'll have them accessible all of the time. Then you need to find out one more thing, and that's the bank select change your device requires. Whether it be LSB or MSB or swapped. I know this is tough, but you'll need to find this in your manual. It's the only way this will work. In my case, Bank A uses Control Change 1, which happens to be modulation in my list, and Bank B uses Control Change 2. You'll need to see at least 2 rows here, one for program changes and one for bank changes. You can select a name for the 128 patches here, but usually preset is fine. There's all the patches. Now we can name all the patches, delete patches we don't need, and add single patches using New Preset. Let's close this and assign the device to a MIDI output. Now close the MIDI Device Manager. Now we can assign the device to our MIDI track and select the presets we set up. Continue on to the next chapter to learn more about MIDI devices.